we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to the second session SENSS is organizing around generative artificial intelligence and its use in research. I'm Fragkiskos Filippaios. I'm a professor of international business at the University of Essex, Essex Business School, and I'm also the director for the SENSS, the South and East Network for Social Sciences, and DTP. I'll start this session by making two disclaimers. Disclaimer one, we're in the middle of the student-led competition, so we're just making our final decisions with regards to awarding studentships for next year. So this is a very busy time for me, and I need to apologize if there are any errors or omissions in my slides. I hope not, but I just want to make that first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is I have no particular expertise around ethics of using Gen AI in research, but I thought that was a good opportunity for me to just get my head around a topic which I think is going to take quite a substantial amount of our time in the future. And as I was putting this presentation together and thinking about, what are the areas I should be covering, what are the things I should be talking about, I have also kind of developed a framework in my mind, which I will present to you towards the end of our presentation, our discussion, and looks very similar to what our deputy director presented in the first session, with a slightly different twist in terms of the dimensions, but again, it's an adaptation, and we have talked with Anna about those two frameworks and how we can bring them together. And it's more of a framework that I would expect someone to utilize in terms of thinking, what are the implications of ethics, and are there any ethical implications when someone is using generative AI in research. So with those two disclaimers, I'll start the session and the presentation, and I'll basically, first of all, as we usually do, is I'll talk a bit about what I will be covering. I thought it was going to be quite useful to consider a bit the background, not necessarily only around generative AI, but generally around ethics in research. And I was fortunate enough, a few years back, I was delivering the supervisor training for the University of Kent, one of my former institutions. And one of the sessions I was giving to new supervisors was, the ethics in research, the ethics in supervision of PhD programs. And I thought it's always useful to have that background, irrespective of whether we're talking about generative AI or not. I'll then talk about what are the challenges that emerge from using Gen AI in research, and what are the ethical challenges. What are the issues we might be facing. I'll talk a bit about the frameworks for consideration. There is already some work taking place around developing frameworks for ethics. Through the preparation of this session, I also looked at several publications, several areas, and I thought it was going to be quite useful to talk a bit about the future research areas in this particular dimension around ethics. And then I said, I've got this proposed way of thinking about ethics when using Gen AI. And given that we are in a peer framework, peer review framework, I'm more than happy to listen to comments, ideas, suggestions about how we can improve that framework. So let me start by touching on the background, first of all. And when you look at ethics in research, there are kind of three areas that you could potentially think about. First of all, is the area which is related to the overall aims of the research conducted. Why are we doing this particular research, and is it an ethical kind of research? Are we trying to benefit humanity? Are we trying to develop new applications that will make everyone's lives easier? It will protect the environment and everything like that. So that's one kind of big ethical question. The second element has to do with the researchers that participate and the relationship of those researchers. Occasionally you get the supervisor, supervisee, you get the head of the lab and the research associates, you've got others, and how those relationships are being shaped. And then, of course, there is ethical questions which are directly related to the research project. One example I can use is, considering the informed consent and whether participants have been informed appropriately. Informed consent is not something which is fluid, is not something that is changes. You can't simply utilize the data for a particularly new question unless you've got very clear consent about those from those participants on the use of their data. So there are several ethical questions, and it's the discussion around ethics in research is not new, actually. There is this very interesting kind of framework by Cressy back in 1973, talking about other people's money. That's the title of the publication, and it talks about the fraud triangle, where researchers kind of have face pressures when it comes to research. And the first one is around motivation. It's publish or perish in these days. And of course, we all have the tendency to kind of try to turn around publications very quickly, and the role of artificial intelligence in supporting us that, our AI right now can do literature review for you. It could almost even write a full paper with the appropriate prompts. If you think about it, then it's around rationalization, where you have a theory, the data doesn't comply with that theory, and you're trying to basically say, okay, there is a problem with the data, and the data is wrong, the data is skewed, without necessarily looking at the reality and what is actually happening there. And then there is the opportunity element of that triangle, where researchers control the data and can easily change them. This is the tendency that a lot of the journals have at the moment, where they actually say, if you have utilized the data set, you need to deposit that data set. It's around the reproducibility and replicability of the results. So academics, kind of scientific research, faces these different pressures, and there is always a tendency, or there is always an opportunity to kind of move into one direction, and the role of artificial intelligence there can be quite important. And then, of course, questionable research practices, they're not, again, new. There is this very interesting, relatively old paper by Guardian, where outright research frauds have made the headlines in the past. There is this 2012 study in the psychological science, where they found that there's still substantial questionable research practices. Selective reporting of positive results, excluding data that affects results, reporting unexpected findings as they're expected. You've got harking, hypothesizing after the results that people tend to do. You look at the data, you look at the results, and then you're trying to come up with hypotheses. And all these things, which do exist at the moment, they're not going to go away when you start looking at the artificial intelligence perspective. But actually, my suggestion is that they will be potentially augmented, because the researcher has more tools in their hands to actually do things that they wouldn't be doing before. So, for example, when you look at excluding data that affects the results, as a researcher is actually relatively, especially when you look at big data and big data set, it's actually quite difficult to find out what is affecting your results and whether there are any particular outliers or whether any particular patterns. A machine learning algorithm or an artificial intelligence algorithm could do that much easier and could provide suggestions if you basically give them the prompt, these are the results I would like to get. Tell me exactly what kind of data do I need to do, or which section of my data gives me those results. So these questions and these issues are not going to go away. They're actually going to be augmented over the years. So when you look, and I promise this is my final challenge in terms of background, when you're looking at the theory of research ethics, and I borrowed the Beauchamp and Childress kind of principles of biomedical ethics, because I think these are the kind of the strictest kind of research ethics. They talk about four principles. The first one is around non-maleficence. So you're not performing research that will create harm, or if you expect harm, you should try to minimize that. It's also about the beneficence. It's not only about minimizing harm, but also trying to maximize the benefit. The autonomy, which is, again, I think, important coming into question when you start using artificial intelligence, which is the respecting the decision-making capacities of autonomous persons, and enable individuals to make reasoned, informed choices. And of course, the justice around that, which is distributing benefits, risks, and costs fairly. So looking at these kind of four principles, I then started thinking, what are the challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence, and what are the challenges that are emerging that particularly touch on ethics and ethical approach to research to artificial intelligence. So my kind of starting point is that obviously AI offers capabilities for data analysis, pattern recognition, modeling. There was this very interesting YouTube video by Google a few months ago, where they were asking an artificial intelligence algorithm to come up with kind of like an analysis of data that the estimation was that it would take a single individual probably a few years to do, even with a relatively powerful computer, and artificial intelligence turned around the results in just a couple of hours. And they were saying that this is effectively only the starting point of artificial intelligence. So it can accelerate scientific discovery and innovation. However, I think this framework raises also critical ethical questions that must be addressed. And I'll talk about each one of them separately in terms of what are these ethical questions. The first one is the challenge of bias. And the challenge of bias is that AI algorithms are effectively trained on data. So what you feed them, and it's not to me a surprise, and I'm inviting you to think about that we tend to hear more and more about artificial intelligence over the last year or so. It wasn't so evident before, at least it wasn't so evident in the wider kind of community. And I think what is happening here is something very similar. I sometimes think about it in the same way I think about crypto coins. For crypto coins to become successful, they need to have a large basis of people that are willing to trade the crypto coins, are willing to save on crypto coins and everything like that. If nobody cares about crypto coins, there is no value in crypto coins. And I think it's exactly the same analogy for artificial intelligence. The more people you get to utilize artificial intelligence, the more you get the algorithm and the machine, because we need to think that at the end of the day, on the other side, it is a machine. The more you get that machine to encounter different human behaviors, different questions, different discussions with humans, the more that algorithm learns. And of course, AI algorithms are trained on this data, and that data can still reflect societal biases. Or the data might not be available, and therefore, the AI algorithm might be trained on selected sets of data, which, represent a particular view of reality. And if you think about economics data, for example, if you try to train an AI algorithm on the analysis of economics data is very well advanced, and we know quite a lot of things, and consistently collected for the global north. But when you look at the global south, the data is not necessarily there, or the data suffers from significant biases. So if you try to train an AI algorithm around analyzing, economics data, you will probably primarily train them on the economic reality of the global north rather than the global south. And this can then lead to biased research outcomes and perpetuate inequalities in the way that if you take those results in an unfiltered way, if you don't think about them, and if you not take them through your own filter of understanding, it's going to be leading to those kind of biased research outcomes. So obviously there are mitigation strategies, and as I was thinking about those challenges, I was thinking about what we could potentially
Sorry for Kiskos.
have I muted myself?
Sorry. You're back now.
All right. So I was thinking about the mitigation strategies for the challenge of bias, and you start talking about obviously the diverse data sets, the bias detection, but the algorithmic fairness. And as I was thinking about the algorithmic fairness, I encountered what I would call my second challenge in terms of artificial intelligence, which is the black box problem. And many AI models lack transparency. And that actually makes it very difficult to understand the decision-making processes, how these AI algorithms, if we're talking about fairness, you can't judge fairness if you're talking about the black box. If you input information, you get an output of information, and if we don't have a very clear understanding of how the AI model works, it's very, very difficult to actually, first of all, trust, and then, of course, I think that's a very crucial term in terms of research, the reproducibility. Are we able to get the same answer? So if you give to an AI algorithm exactly the same data sets, will they be able to give you two answers that are identical in the same way that, if I use a data set and I run, I don't know, multiple regression analysis, if I use exactly the same variables, if I use exactly the same assumptions, I don't expect to get different results. Is this the case here when it comes to AI models? Are we talking about the fairness of the artificial intelligence? And can we understand, will we be able to understand, because obviously here you have significant elements around intellectual property rights protection from the companies that develop these models and everything like that. And obviously the mitigation strategy there is that the development of what is called the explainable AI, or as sometimes it's referred in the literature as XAI, is essential. It is essential to be able to understand, what is actually happening, and how it is happening. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about, I've mentioned the data. I've mentioned my data sets. I'm an empirical economist by nature. I tend to use data sets to evaluate the way multinationals are making decisions. I started thinking there is also an issue related to the first challenge around not only the fairness and the understanding of the algorithm, but there is also an issue around the protection of sensitive data. And AI research often involves large data sets. If you have a relatively small data set, then you could do the analysis yourself without actually requiring to do, significant AI algorithms or anything like that. I think where things get complicated is when you start having large data sets potentially some of those data sets containing personal informations. Think about, for example, in the post-COVID period, we have become what I would call almost like a cashless economy. Most of our transactions are recorded through our, cards, our bank cards. And think about the amount of information that is generated on someone's spending patterns and consumption patterns through that data. And think about feeding that large data set into an AI model and coming up with, identifying specific advertisements, pushing products to you. And that's a very simple kind of relatively light from an ethics point of view example. Think about medical information. We all want to train AI data sets around predicting with a better way and faster than what a human could do diseases, but that will require the feeding those models large amounts of sensitive data, people's examination results, people's radiography results, and things like that. And talking about radiography, actually on my developing of this session, I looked at the Royal Society of Radiographers, who has actually very recently, for those of you that you have an interest into that, into medical research, has actually developed a very clear guidelines on the way radiography results should be used into the artificial intelligence models in order to feed and in order to help those models predict patients' kind of outputs. So the robust data privacy and security measures are paramount. Obviously, compliance with regulations such as GDPR is essential, but it's not only that, it's also here an opportunity to enhance further those regulations. And I'll stop my discussion around this challenge with a question that I want to ask you, and that you could consider. How many of you have used AI and you have fed AI pieces of information? So imagine someone feeding into an AI generative AI model, their PhD thesis, or publications, not necessarily ones that are in the public domain, but drafts of papers. All that information becomes part of the database that the AI is being trained on. And effectively, it is, for some of you, could be very sensitive information, because it might be, interviews of people that you have done. Think about you want to do a thematic analysis, and you feed the interview transcripts to artificial intelligence, and the AI algorithm provides you with certain themes that emerge from that analysis. All these things are things that you should be considering, before you hit that send button on any of the AI algorithms, whether you're using ChatGPT, whether you're using Gemini from Google, or Deep Blue. Think about, where is that information ending up, and who then has access to that information, and have you read the terms and conditions of using that AI model, and are you confident that whatever you're feeding it is not going to end up in someone else's kind of ideas and pockets? So really important. And we as researchers are the ones that engage in that process. So the fourth challenge, as I was thinking about it, is around this establishing responsibility. Who's responsible? Who takes accountability for AI-driven research outcomes? You can't simply say, "Oh, this is coming from an AI algorithm. I don't take responsibility. I'm not." Human oversight is crucial to ensure ethical use, prevent unintended consequences. And in reality, what we would expect to do is AI to augment human research, not replace it. The AI is still a tool that we as researchers have in our hands to enhance and augment the way we do research instead of simply replacing the way we do research. So it's really important. And um, in the next few slides, where I'm talking about the frameworks for consideration, these elements of responsibility and these elements of accountability are actually the most crucial and important ones when you start thinking about the ethics of AI when it comes to research. Most of the most of the organizations that have published ethics guidance around artificial intelligence, they talk about, because we know it can't be stopped. We know that it's not something that it's the flavor of the day. It's here to stay. Most of those frameworks saying, look, we can't stop you from utilizing AI, but what we would like you to do is two things. First of all, is recognize the use of AI. Don't pretend that it's your own work. Someone could actually say, this is an AI generated text. And in order for that text to be good enough, you need to use your prompts. You can't simply, the better and the more detailed prompts you're actually using with artificial intelligence, the better the outcome you will get. So you need to actually say, yes, this is an AI generated. It's generated through prompts that we have actually used, but also when you submit it for funding, publication, whatever, you take the final responsibility. So if AI, and I think eventually this will become an issue of the past. Until very recently, AI had serious hallucinations. I think that attracted a lot of attention, and this is now being minimized. Um, so if in the past AI, was coming up with sources that didn't exist or sources that were not there, you know, at the end of the day, you as a researcher have the responsibility to check the output of that AI algorithm and think about the implications and think about, am I presenting something here which makes sense, or am I presenting something here which basically is based on non-factual information. So looking at those four challenges, and I can go back, the challenge of bias, the black box, the data and the sensitive data, and the responsibility, what are the frameworks that we can consider in order to shape our thinking and our mindset around the ethics of utilizing artificial intelligence? And again, there are some frameworks that specifically talk about the ethics of AI, but there are also frameworks that relate back to research and the ethics of research as a whole. And I think before moving straight to the ethics of AI, I'd like to present two frameworks, or one framework, which actually covers research and research ethics as a whole. And that is the framework by the UUK Concordat to support research integrity. Originally published in 2012, there is a 2019 version, which talks about four kind of pillars underpinning integrity: honesty, and that is actually the appreciation and saying that I have actually utilized AI. Rigor, in the sense that the researchers should actually be looking into the AI generating content and look at, is it complying with the researcher's perspectives, the researcher's views? Transparency and open communication in reporting research findings, being really upfront around the use of AI, and care and respect. And of course, here you're talking about participants and subjects of research, stewardship of research and scholarship for future generations. So I think before we move on straight to the AI ethical frameworks, revisiting the research integrity, but also the research misconduct from the UK conquered that, are two very interesting perspectives. Fabrication, making up results as if they are real, falsification, where you manipulate the research project process. This relates specifically to the black box of AI. Plagiarism, is it plagiarism to actually utilize artificial intelligence generating content and say, this is my content? Should you actually put a disclaimer there? And then obviously failure to meet ethical, legal, and professional obligations around breach of confidentiality, lack of informed consent. So, for example, when you're thinking about the example I used earlier around interviews, and you're planning to take those interviews through an artificial intelligence mechanism in order to conduct thematic analysis, that is something that you need to declare very clearly in your consent form, because access to those interviews is not only, you're not going to have only access to those interviews, but there will be an AI algorithm. And if I was a participant in this project, I would have significant questions as to whether I should be taking part if I knew that my interview would go through an AI algorithm, because that information is then becomes almost information which is in the public domain, and obviously improper dealing with allegations of misconduct. Now, let me move on to the framework which are specifically around AI, and I'm not gonna delve into them. I've got the links here for you, and you can look at them. So I've if you look at a very wider framework, UNESCO has done some brilliant work. It's talk about ethics, and the ethics framework is not only around research, it covers other areas as well. A lot of the principles we have been discussing already are part of that work. And then I took two large organizations that are conducting research. European Commission has developed guidelines around the responsible use of generative AI, and UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, has also generated guidance around artificial intelligence use, not only in terms of the submission of proposals, but also something that has come up a lot the last few months, as I'm reading the research academic news, where it's not only about the creation of papers that people are using artificial intelligence. Occasionally, they ask artificial intelligence to review papers. So you get an invitation as a reviewer for a journal. What you do is you basically run that paper through artificial intelligence algorithm and ask AI to provide you with some comments. You could feed it potentially some more papers around that area and see what is the outcome. And again, if I'm a researcher that has submitted a paper to that journal, have I given my consent for that paper to be reviewed by any artificial intelligence algorithm? And if I haven't given explicitly my consent, then that is highly unethical on behalf of whoever is doing the review process. So I leave those three links there for you to kind of read and think about. But if I could summarize, the principle of no harm and the principle of benefiting everyone are two important principles that are being picked up in the UNESCO. And the principle of accountability and responsibility are two very important principles that are actually being picked up specifically when it comes to research from the European Commission and the UKRI. Especially around the UKRI, it's very clear. It's one of the most kind of flexible guidance I've seen around the use of AI. In effect, it says, look, this is something we can't stop. This is something we can't basically force people not to do. But what we would expect our contributors, the people that submit, the people that review, is to explicitly appreciate and acknowledge the use of AI in the submission they have prepared for us. And when they say explicitly appreciate and acknowledge, it has two dimensions. It's not simply acknowledgement. Yes, I have used AI, but it's also the appreciation. Where have I used AI? For which purpose have I used AI? So it's not simply, you produce a paper and say, oh, I've used AI. I've made the statement. Oh, I've now taken, accountability for that. But it's also providing evidence on which areas you have actually utilized artificial intelligence, where in which sections of is it AI used for data analysis? Is it AI used for literature review? What is it? In which areas of that research project have you actually utilized AI? And in my journey in developing the slides for this session, I came across this very interesting paper, which is in Nature Machine Intelligence. It's actually a relatively recent paper. I've got it there, where the authors talk about guidelines for ethical use and acknowledgement of large language models in academic writing. And the authors basically highlights, and if you look at the paper, it actually has a very interesting template that people can actually use, colleagues can use to complement the research around how they have used artificial intelligence. The first one is around human vetting and guaranteeing of accuracy and integrity. So at least one human author must be able to guarantee and take responsibility for the accuracy and integrity of the article, including each substantive claim and the supporting evidence. So it shouldn't be, simply machine generated or artificial intelligence generated. The second one is that there's still substantial human contribution to the work. And when we talk about substantial human contribution, is not simply, the conception or the design. It's, of course, the conception and the design. It's also the acquisition, analysis, interpretation of the data. But equally, because you're talking about large language models, generative AI, the design of prompts, the fine-tuning procedures, and the integration of those outputs into the manuscript. It's almost as if you think about, you write an academic paper with the use of AI on one side, and then you're very clearly explaining the process through which you engage with artificial intelligence in order to generate that content. It's almost like you're keeping a log file. This is what I did. This is why I did it. This is how I did it. This is what changes made. And the more you develop these logs, the more you become aware, self-aware of your inputs, your interaction with artificial intelligence, the more your contribution to the work, the better you will be able to guarantee the accuracy and integrity. And then, of course, the third element, it's the element that most people tend to do. So in reality, what most people tend to do now has become third in the process here. It's not important. Most people think that, oh, I have acknowledged and I'm transparent about my LLM, large language models, or GenAI use. This is where my responsibility finishes. That's it. No, that's your starting point, the appropriate acknowledgement. We're using GenAI in understanding, verifying, replicating, so on and so forth, confirming the authorship credit. But equally, we need to be able to demonstrate our contribution, and we also need to be able to demonstrate that we have and we can guarantee the accuracy and integrity of that whole process. So it's a three-page document. The paper I'm referring to. I found it quite useful and interesting in terms of helping me understand a bit more about ethics and artificial intelligence. Now, again, in my process of reviewing the materials and looking through papers, research articles, I have identified several future research areas. And I think given that we're talking about ethics in AI, this is not something that, you know, will go away. It is here to stay. And if anybody wants to have kind of additional reading or additional research in this area, these are the areas I think will take our attention, will draw our attention in the next few years. The ones, most of them I have already mentioned. Bias in AI, you know, people could look at, you know, the different AI algorithms, you know, what is the sources of bias, you know, how can you get, what is the impact on research outcomes, and how can we mitigate them. Imagine, you know, they are going to help us address the AI black box. Imagine if you're using two different generative AI models and you're getting very different outputs from these two models. You know, you need to understand why you're getting these outputs, why you're effectively, you know, giving you different responses. And then, of course, that leads to the explainable AI, which is AI models that are transparent, interpretable. Instead of talking about the black box, we move to the white box to build trust and accountability. And the more we understand the process of generative AI, and this is why I said earlier, you know, once you engage with generative AI and you start looking at the log, you start looking at how it responds to different questions, how it responds to different prompts, you'll get a better understanding of the way the algorithm is producing responses. AI and scientific integrity, very interesting here. You know, it has been picked up now. The question of authorship, is an AI, generative AI model, something that should be acknowledged as a co-author for a scientific paper or not? Obviously, future research will be around data privacy and security, especially around large data sets. You know, how do we protect the sensitive information? What is the data governance? What is the privacy preserving AI? What is the impact on data security? What are the breaches that could happen, and how do we ensure that, you know, we're minimizing the impact? And of course, you know, the philosophy of AI ethics, the philosophical underpinnings, you know, the ethical theories that guide the development and use of AI. Is it, you know, a threat? Is it something that will create opportunities? Is it taking over the world? Or is it taking over our jobs as academics and educators? You know, will AI in the future be able to substitute, you know, the human interaction and become a substitute for everyone there? What is going to happen, and how does that matter or not for our development as humanity? So I'm concluding this section around, you know, the research areas, and I'm concluding the session actually with a final thought. And I said, okay, if I'm a researcher, and it was a very interesting and nice exercise, because it has taken my mind away from the student-led competition, which was all about numbers and making decisions and ensuring that, you know, we got a robust and transparent process. So I thoroughly enjoyed putting the session together, and you could potentially tell, due to my passion, how my final thought was, you know, how can I actually conceptualize? Can I bring it down to, you know, what in business schools we like are 2x2 matrices? And you could tell from Anna's presentation last time that, you know, we love our 2x2 because we feel that they can kind of help us conceptualize ideas and at the same time provide analysis and, you know, a framework of thought shouldn't be complex and shouldn't be complicated. It should be relatively simple, so it can help us at least understand what we're doing. So I thought about two dimensions when you're utilizing generative AI in research. The first one was around purpose. I think we've got a question. Shall I stop before? Michael, is it a question relevant to this one?
No, you can finish first. I'm just trying to raise my hand so that as soon as you finish, then I'll be the first.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I'll finish first, and then we'll take questions. So the two dimensions are first of all purpose. Why are we using it? What is our intentions? Intention? Do we have a conscious decision, a plan? To use it. What is our goal? What is the desired outcome, the desired result, and why are we doing it? And just to give you an academic example, an undergraduate student's purpose of utilizing generative AI is to produce an essay for an undergraduate module in order to pass that module and basically not put any effort. So I would consider this one to be relatively an unethical purpose of utilizing artificial intelligence. In the same way that I would consider an unethical way of utilizing artificial intelligence if someone is basically utilizing AI model in order to manipulate the results of a large data set. Equally, the purpose could be actually quite ethical. The purpose could be to improve people's lives, to improve research that is currently being done. If you look at the way medical research is utilizing AI, a lot of these things have a very good kind of ethical dimension to it. So that's one dimension. The other dimension, which I think it's really, really important, and I'm hoping that the series of sessions we are organizing are helping you to understand a bit better, is this literacy dimension, the ability. Do we know the implications of its use? Do we know why it's producing the results? Do we know how to use it? And then, of course, this literacy ability is a continuum. You never stop learning. Going back to my Greek background, Greek philosophers used to say that we learn as long as we live, and we live as long as we learn, in a way. So it's a continuum. You encounter new things. It's also contextual, and it varies depending on the situation and the type of information that we encounter. But it's also complex. It's not simply, oh, I'm writing. It's not simply, oh, I've read this paper on artificial intelligence and I know everything about artificial intelligence right now. As I said, I started with disclaimer, I'm not an expert, and I don't think I will ever be an expert on AI. I think AI will probably be quite a few steps ahead of us every single time. But I'd like to see how I can critically evaluate the information, navigate the digital environments, understand this complex concept. So, if I have at least an awareness of my inefficiencies as someone that is utilizing artificial intelligence, is better than actually having no awareness at all. So I thought about these two dimensions and said, okay, let me put them onto this kind of framework where you have the purpose on the horizontal axis, ethical, the literacy on the vertical with low and high, and you've got, and then I spent some time coming up with kind of these names for these bits where, I think for me, the most difficult to tackle is the ignorance risk, where people are actually having no understanding of what they're doing with their AI, and at the same time they're trying to do it in an unethical way. So I would suggest that this is the example I used with the undergraduate student. Oh, they've heard their friends are using AI. They've heard, oh, you could put the topic into Gemini or ChatGPT, and they will give you an essay. And I think that's the ignorance risk, and it's the ignorance risk not only because you're doing it for a bad purpose, to cheat, to trick the system, but because also it doesn't help you move from that low literacy to high literacy that at least will kind of give you something as a development. And then, of course, most people so far, they've been using AI in what I would call the guided good, where we don't yet know exactly. We still train ourselves. We still try to find out what we're doing, but at the same time, we're not trying to do it for an ethical purpose. We're trying to do it for ethical purposes. And then, of course, hopefully, as we improve our literacy, we will become, go into that area where you've got the expert benefit, where, you've got the expertise, but at the same time, you're utilizing it for the benefit of others and for the benefit of society. And I think that's my last thought. I'd like to leave you with that last thought and kind of invite you, for those of you that you haven't already come across this one, to join us for our next session, which is theoretical perspectives on AI, Monday the 7th of April, 2 to 3 British Summer Time, changing the time on Sunday. Dr. Harry Dyer from School of Education at the University of East Anglia. Harry is a thematic chair for the Digital Social Sciences panel, and I've got there the Eventbrite link. Feel free to join us for that session. Thank you for your attention. I'll open it up to questions with whatever brain I have left after all these days of hard work. And I think it's probably easier if I stop sharing my screen, because that means that I can see most of you. Michael, you've got your hand up. We can't hear you. So we go to Lurette and come back to Michael. Lurette?
Okay. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I really learned a lot. Mine, I think, is more like a comment, but it might come with some questions. I'm actually a second-year PhD researcher at Cardiff University, and I'm working on the integration experiences of forcibly displaced migrant women in Wales as a nation of sanctuary. So I'm using visual elicitations and also semi-structured interviews. Now, as I'm writing up, I came across Elicit. I went for a training, and I was like, okay, let me put my hands to it. So I used the function where I would search for papers or PDF or papers generally. And sometimes when I look at my research and I'm like, okay, I'm using semi-structured interviews, I, as you mentioned, critically think through the process I've been through, and then maybe feed into AI and ask, can I have views about what researchers or other scholars think about using semi-structured interviews or visual elicitations of forcibly displaced migrant women? And a lot comes out. But initially, when I was new to AI, I used to feel a bit guilty of some of the things you mentioned, like, am I really critically thinking about this? Am I going back into the papers? Am I actually reading them, synthesizing the information and applying it to my research? But I'm glad that you've mentioned that and it has helped me. But the question I want to ask here is, I know sometimes I use the feedback from AI in my work. I try as much as possible to synthesize the evidence, to cite what I've seen, but I'm just wondering, honestly, sometimes I feel a bit guilty. So can I have a little advice regarding this? Thank you very much.
So I wouldn't feel guilty. I'll basically even try to train Gemini to adopt my writing style by feeding it my published papers, not manuscripts that I haven't published, because this is a different thing. So I think what you're doing is correct. You're utilizing to get feedback on the work you're doing. And I think there, the most important thing is the development of that literacy, the literacy skills, an understanding of what AI can, what AI can't do, and where should we actually, draw the boundaries and get that feedback. And it's the same thing that you would do with feedback from any other human being. You know, you talk to your supervisor, the supervisor gives you feedback. Sometimes you agree, sometimes you disagree, sometimes you take it on board, sometimes you don't take it on board. As long as you approach it with a critical perspective, a critical eye, this is absolutely fine. My only kind of question mark is, are you feeding the algorithm of AI parts of your thesis or things that you have been writing, which might contain information that perhaps you wouldn't like it to be disclosed? And I think there are some of those algorithms that allow you to basically exclude whatever you're feeding from, you know, the wider learning model that they're using. So that would be my only comment. You know, think about the information you're providing the algorithm and whether that contains sensitive information about your research, sensitive information about the participants of your studies, and things like that. That would be my only highlight there. And of course, I've realized Anna and I think Mark, they're also here. So feel free to you know, shoot me down if I'm talking nonsense, or if you want to come in and add things. Michael.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I know some schools, universities now are maybe purchasing AI that they say as students we can use, that the data we input in it is not going to be public. I don't know whether you can say anything about that. I know that for University of Sussex, we have Copilot that we can use from the university, but how authentic, how are we too sure that even the data we put in it is private as they claim?
So yes, a lot of universities are going to move down the route of either Copilot or Gemini or anything like that as an instrument to facilitate. I think the question is answered by the nature of the data and the terms and conditions you sign to access any data set. So if the terms and conditions, so before you access any data set, you know, if you're thinking about Essex data sets like Understanding Society or things like that, before you access them, the terms and conditions you sign very clearly specify whether the data can be used in an AI environment or not, whether the data can be used for any other purposes except research purposes, or whether there is any commercial application of that data that it should be acknowledged. So I would be guided by the terms and conditions of your data set in order to say, yes, this is a data set I can share with, you know, an AI algorithm like Copilot, or this is through Microsoft Excel, or this is a data set that I cannot share because it has specific disclaimers attached to it. So that would be, I don't think here it's the same thing as if you were to share, you know, download the data and share it with a third party. It's I would treat it in exactly the same way. I don't think there is any difference here, talking about AI or non-AI kind of approaches.
Okay, we sometimes, because some people say we can input our data for proofreading, or what our write-up for proofreading on AI, and we use the university AI for proofreading. I don't know if that is still ethical or safe. It's our work.
Again, I don't think this is an ethics question. You know, if you were to use a human proofreader, it could improve substantially the quality of the paper. You know, all of us over the years have used human proofreaders, and you know, we have acknowledged that in the paper. So if you do acknowledge it in your papers, that's absolutely fine. You could use, you know, people have used things like Scribendi or Grammarly or things like that, which are semi-artificial intelligence kind of platforms where they can correct your spelling, your grammar and things like that. So acknowledging, taking responsibility though, just because it's being proofread by one of those AI platforms doesn't mean that it's absolutely correct. Sometimes you need to choose whether the correction is right or wrong, because sometimes those platforms lose the meaning of what you're trying to say. So it might be that you need to work around it. But again, what is quite important is to think about the information that you feed the artificial intelligence algorithm and whether you would like the AI to have access to that information. And just to give you an example, I had very recently one of my PhD students completed, and he said, "Oh, I'll take it through AI." And I said, "Are you sure you want to get your full PhD through an artificial intelligence algorithm that they can then rely on that information you've provided for future training and future?" It's almost as if you're giving away, 3 years, 4 years worth of work to someone to learn. And yes, of course, we do it as academics because we publish our papers, we take them through publications, we get no money for the peer review process, and yet the publishers make millions on it. But would you be happy to do that in an artificial intelligence setting where you actually don't know what's happening? We haven't opened up the black box and looked into that black box. And that would be my comment.
Thank you.
Right, I think we're over time now. And there are not that many questions, which means that I have either addressed everything or I haven't done a proper job, which means that I haven't sparked kind of interest in the discussion. I don't know which way. We'll find out from the feedback. As a closing remark, thank you very much for attending. We're putting a lot of effort putting these sessions together. We're also trying to have some research coming out of it, especially around the area of literacy. So we will be asking you to fill some questionnaires before and after the different sessions. Please, please, please help us understand better. It is a work in progress for everyone, I think, and the better we understand, the more information we have, it means that we can improve practices as researchers. And again, as a final note, to invite you to come to our next session on the 7th of April, Harry Dyer, talking about theoretical perspectives of AI. Yes, Helen, the recording will be available. I think we're recording so far, so we will be putting onto our YouTube channel and the SENSS VLE. Thank you very much, everyone.